My name is Josie Mitchell from Tank Magazine, and today on the Tank podcast, I'm with Fatima Bhutto, author of the political memoir Songs of Blood and Sword and the novel The Shadow of the Crescent Moon. Today, we're going to talk about her new novel, The Runaways, which follows three young people offering a close read psychological study of what might lead someone to become radicalised and consider significant violence against their society. Fatima has said that she came to write this book in 2014 when the fear surrounding ISIS was perhaps at its highest, because she felt that no one was really asking how it came to this terrifying moment. No one was asking how much pain you'd have to go or be in to go to war against the world. And her book, in a way, sets out to ask these questions, focusing on the humanity of people we can identify with, teenagers with social anxiety and pushy parents who, nevertheless, each in their own way, become radicalised by a system that seems to offer what they currently lack. I really enjoyed the tension between the political and the personal, the general in the book. But I thought maybe what we could start with to sort of set the scene was going back to 2014 or going back to when the project started, when sort of like a bit like now, where everything's just about Brexit, everything is about Trump. It was almost the same, but everything was about ISIS, or everything was about this violence.
Yeah.
And just maybe thought I'd ask what that felt like at the time, or if we could go back to the texture of that experience.
Yeah, it was a profoundly alienating time, I felt. Because at that time you had the issue of migration. That was all anyone could talk about in Europe. And they kept calling it a crisis. But, you know, the crisis they meant for themselves. And obviously it wasn't a crisis for Europe. It's a crisis for the Afghans, the Somalis, the Iraqis, the Syrians, who've had their countries set on fire and who've left their homes and their schools and their families. But the way it was spoken about, and I was traveling through Europe at the time, was in this really cold way. You know, oh, these people are coming here. They're, you know, coming into our hospitals. They're taking our... And I heard this said by people who were otherwise, you know, reasonable, compassionate, friendly, open people. And it felt ugly to me. And I started to feel, I keep saying I felt wounded, but it did feel, I felt wounded and I felt really alienated by those sentiments. And at the same time, you know, Daesh was kind of hitting the world's newspapers and news. And everybody really loved calling it Islamic State. Like they took a particular pleasure in using that word. And so I would always try to say Daesh rather than Islamic State, because I don't accept that it's an Islamic State. What state, you know? What Islamic? And so on the other side, I felt angry at having to somehow explain things all the time, you know, because people would see you and they would identify you with this terrible peripheral thing. Peripheral in the sense that, you know, out of more than 1 billion Muslims, they are a tiny percentage. And they're a violent, psychotic percentage. Why does it have to stay in the rest of us?
I'm curious as well, because I guess you have this unique, or maybe not unique, but unusual combination of places where you've kind of grown up. So you were educated in the UK and in the US and also live in Pakistan. So were there distinct differences as well, maybe, that maybe one person might have a particular sense of how that felt, but the differences between moving the two must have been strange.
Well, you know what's interesting is that when I'm in Pakistan, there's this sort of relief at being amongst people who understand you, who know the same things you know, who feel the same things you feel, and you can kind of just be at rest. You don't always have to be at battle. I mean, okay, you have to be at battle on other fronts, but I felt that the general experience of what it's like to be an Asian person, a brown person, you know, a non-white Western person, has become so fraught over the past 5 years. And you feel it everywhere. You feel it at airports, you feel it in conversation, you feel it with newspapers, with any time you open the news. But to be in Pakistan was to understand something pretty basic, I thought, about radicalism, which is that it's not a religious phenomenon. You know, even if we go back to the history of radical movements, they were always political movements. You know, they are national or ethnic or economically inspired. And I feel like we kind of understood that there. Whereas in the West, radicalism was just, for some reason, identified as a religious thing. And it seems like a really weird misunderstanding.
One of the things I loved about the book was the fact that you identified that. So it is a story about teenagers. It's a story about alienated teenagers for many, many different reasons, and it really doesn't begin with an obsession with a religion. If anything, it starts with very normal, banal, common frustrations, like not feeling like you have friends or...
Yeah.
And maybe we can touch on later.
Yeah.
You also draw in a lot of what you maybe refer to as millennial confusion,
Yeah.
which I think is a really interesting thing to talk about. But maybe what we could start with is introducing the three.
Yeah.
So there's three protagonists in the book.
Yeah.
Maybe you could tell me a bit about each of them.
So there were three main characters and then several other, I wouldn't even call them secondary characters, but their stories grow, whereas you always begin with these three. There is Anita Rose, who lives in Macha Colony, which is a slum in Karachi. And her mother is a malishwali, which means that she's a woman who goes around the houses of these very rich women to massage their bodies. And then you have Monty, who also lives in Karachi, but really on the other side of the city as Anita, in a totally different Karachi. He lives, in this wide avenued neighborhood. He's got a huge gate in front of his house. He goes to the American school and he wants for nothing. And then you have Sunny in Portsmouth, and Sunny is from an Indian background. His father migrates from Lucknow, but Sunny himself is born in Portsmouth and grows up in Portsmouth and begins to feel that he doesn't quite belong. He doesn't initially understand why, but Sunny has a lot of displacement, on several fronts.
Well, there's big differences in each of these individuals and their experience, but I guess as you're sort of talking about, as the book kind of it continues, they all are in their own way maybe alienated from their community. The thing that struck me as quite striking in what made this different to perhaps other periods where people have had similar experience was the fact that you could know about everyone else. It doesn't seem like any other time that so many people across the world are so aware of like the American subculture, like the American West. You have this scene where Monty is in London and he's there with a young maid who's come with them, and she's watching a catwalk show. And it's sort of, he's expressed this worry that she's a little naive for London, and yet she's watching this catwalk show. I don't know what it would be, like RuPaul's Drag Race or something, and it's sort of that capacity to have all. And I just wonder what you think that affects, how that's played into this thing that you're describing as a more of a political than a religious phenomenon.
Yeah, I think, the idea, obviously, of a clash of civilizations we know is ridiculous and facile and not true. But I think what has presented itself as not only true but dangerous is essentially the lie of globalization. Globalization was promised to facilitate movement and opportunity and access and the having of all things. And it didn't do that. It accelerated and made things more accessible for a small segment of people that already had access, but it didn't really do anything for large fields of people. So what you have, if you go to a place like India, or you go to a place like Pakistan, you're driving through these cities and you have these gargantuan billboards, of Magnum ice cream being advertised by sort of semi-naked models, and it is a world in collision. And I think that creates a whole load of confusions for people who want access but are stopped by the gatekeepers. And so that you see quite a bit in Monty's story, whether it's through the experiences of this young maid who comes to London, and also Monty himself, who doesn't have that collision, he doesn't have that shock because he's never been told he can't have those things. So he moves quite easily. Monty's shock is totally different. Monty's shock is in his own country. Monty has that collision in his own city, which he barely knows because he only lives in a neighborhood. He doesn't live amongst the majority of Karachi's population. So yeah, I think the Runaways, especially in Monty's story, moves between those worlds and the different gatekeepers there are and the different ways in which one is isolated.
I think the other tension that's playing out, as much as there is a clash of cultures, there's also a clash of the inequality.
That's it.
So the sort of globalization also facilitates anyone who has access to a phone screen or an internet access to see these idealized visions of the Kardashians living in their homes. And that's such a strange thing to witness from, say, an incredibly impoverished area anywhere in the world. I think you make that point well. There's this moment where Sonny, who is growing up in Portsmouth, or his father, perhaps it's in the voice of his father, is comparing the poverty you have in Portsmouth with India and saying almost which one is worse. They're just different in their aesthetic, but they're similarly degrading.
Yes. In fact, Sonny's father thinks that the poverty of England is more degrading.
That's the really striking line. He finds, I mean, I forget the exact line, but it's to do with these the rubbish on the streets and the sort of...
Well, I think, yes, it is a book set against not just inequality, but I think the burning backdrop of inequality. And again, one of the sort of narrative lies we've been fed over the last 20, 50 years is that inequality exists in the global south, but the West is this paragon of equality and liberation and all kinds of things. And of course, it's not true. And that's the experience that Sonny's father, Suleiman Jamil, has when he comes to Portsmouth, which is that there is poverty here. And it's somehow more depressing because it includes loneliness, which you don't have in a place like India. You know, it's waiting in queues at benefit offices. It's standing alone at supermarket lines with old women who have no one else to talk to and who will do anything for a conversation, even with a stranger. And also, you know, there is an experience in South Asia, at least, which again I think comes from that section, and again through the voice of Sonny's father, where he says, it doesn't matter how wealthy or privileged you are in a place like India, it is impossible for people to forget how frail man is and how frail life is and how vulnerable we all are, because your contact with that vulnerability is constant. Whereas in the West, you can trick yourself into being or feeling distant from it, but it's there. You know, it's there in the homeless lives. It's there in the loneliness and all the degradations that includes.
It's really interesting. I love that. I love what you're saying there about the loneliness, the quality of loneliness that happens in these, which are, I guess, other symptoms of globalization as well. You have these service stations where you go to Tesco and you don't need to take your headphones out for the entire process of buying something. You can have loud music playing all the way because you haven't had to hear what someone has said to you, and that's normalized but remains strange. It makes me think also about what countries or people choose to export and publicise. So Sonny's father has come to London partly because of an obsession with James Bond films. Yes. And that expectation has been brought and it's been so different. Yeah. And that again seems to, I think, be folded really nicely into the novel because social media becomes a really big part of the way that these young people, and particularly Sonny, are looking for validation or community.
Yeah, I think
I'm really curious about the way that you use social media, things like Twitter and Snapchat in the book.
Yeah, I think what was really terrifying about Daesh was how modern it was. You know, unlike other fundamentalist movements, it didn't value the things that we assumed they would. So secrecy, discretion, it didn't really care for that. Rather, it had this really millennial modern approach to like publicity, propaganda. It's all glossy, you know, drone footage, you know, these kind of camera shots of people holding their phones in front of their faces. Hashtags. Yeah. You know, I remember watching some of these videos online before I started writing, and I was amazed by not only how glossy the videos were, there was music, there were subtitles, there were multilingual subtitles, there were sometimes in French and English, or, you know, French and Arabic. Wow. Yeah. And also the voices of these people were not Arab voices. They were Dutch voices, German voices, Australian voices. It really had this global multi-culti kind of tone to it. And one of the things that you noticed as well in that early period, 2014-15, which now is not there so much anymore, was the rampant use of social media. And it wasn't like social media used differently, because it's being used now by, I mean, people in the midst of beheadings and executions. But it was social media used exactly as everyone uses social media, which means, like you said, the hashtags. It meant the selfies, like the constant selfies. You know, there were a lot of AMA Ask Me Anything Reddit threads.
I did not know about that. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
I tried to look for some of them recently, and they've been pulled down.
They've
Yeah,
been raised from the internet.
they've been raised from the internet. There were Twitter Q&As, and they were as banal as Twitter Q&As are. You know, some of it was like, okay, how do I come out if I want to come out? Do you have any recommendations for like what food to bring? You know, what's married life like under the caliphate? And I would look at these and think, it's like any millennial anywhere. They just want to be famous. And they kind of want to be gurus to this new way of life. It doesn't matter. You know, that it's not really even life. It's kind of death, afterlife. But they treat it the same way.
I think that's true. I think that the in the novel what comes across are these really normal, familiar social media interactions, and it's really disconcerting, but also makes so much sense when you think about the fact that these are teenagers. And what's so scary is, you know, the like culture, the comment culture, the like taking a selfie and getting that feedback. I think the novel makes a really good argument for, not necessarily an argument, I'm saying you're arguing for something, but asks really interesting questions about like Islam versus, say, Twitter being sort of equally, if not like Twitter being almost more of a drive for a person in their daily thinking about what they're doing than
also,
anything.
What I think is important in real life, and certainly in the novel, is the way in which social media is a mask. You know, social media is a disguise to who we are in real life. And that's used as much by militants as it is by, you know, millennial influencers. It's this version of yourself that simply cannot be true, because it is always happy, it is always wanted, it is needed, and it is significant. And we just know that actually the business of the self is a painful business. And there's no consistency in any observation of the self, except in social media. Even if we look at the news today, we look at the stories of these young women who have actually run away and gone to join. They say such interesting things about religion. You know, all of the women, whether it's Shamima Begum or the woman from Alabama, they both said that they became religious just before going. They didn't really know very much about religion. They wouldn't be able to point out passages in the Quran or in any other religious text. So it was this kind of Chinese whispers, Twitter version of religion. Someone told them something, they kind of put their own spin on it, retweeted it, and it gets reposted and morphed as it goes along.
I think I read something that you've written or said about this elsewhere, and it resonated about our tendency to label this a religious issue or label this as sort of like a mental illness, when that seems to allow us to avoid structural problems. The possibility that this might be in fact a result of someone not being provided with support or community or mentorship, and when somebody comes with that as an offer, that person suddenly can latch on very quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, look, even at the case of Shamima Begum today, it's the fact that she was denied a place in her society, or that she felt that she would not be given a place in her society. That's part of what drives her out of it. And now that she says, after, I think, understanding the violence and the error of her choices, I think for her to say, I regret that decision, it was mine entirely, please can I come home? And to be told, no, we don't want you. That's the same problem. And that's going to radicalize, an entirely new generation of people who suspect that their homes may not want them.
Yeah.
That's all the proof they need, really, isn't it?
I think that's really well put. It must have been a really intense experience doing the research for the book. I guess going and submitting yourself to all of the sort of like Twitter and videos and all of the things that probably were required to create the texture of this experience.
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. I mean, no, because, this violence is so widespread already. It's not like finding Daesh videos brought me face to face with violence, because I've been watching those videos since the occupation of Iraq. I've been watching those videos since all those pilot footage videos were released from drone control rooms of pilots laughing when they hit their targets, of cheering each other on as they blew up wedding parties. I mean, Abu Ghraib, all that and that's, now almost 20 years worth of those videos, are part of our memories of the last 20, or the war on terror in general. So the violence of Daesh was not necessarily new. Certainly it was horrific and it was ugly to watch. But we'd kind of seen it before. We'd seen it coming out of Fallujah and Kandahar and Pakistan. And these were just different people in the videos. So in that sense, what was really unusual for me was the other stuff, was the banality of life out there, was the videos of these young men saying they miss their mothers, and they had really bad Wi-Fi. I didn't expect that, so that's what really tripped me up, I guess, when I was watching. And also how media savvy they were, how internet friendly they were, how media savvy they were. I didn't expect that, so that for me was shocking and strange. So that was one part of the research, and a lot of the other parts were things that I guess I felt or have seen or have heard over the last 20 years. So the isolation and the alienation and the feelings of powerlessness and humiliation that, I had stocks of to build on.
Mm-hmm. Were you ever tempted to write the book as non-fiction? Was it always a fictional project?
It was always fictional, yeah. I had no interest in doing it as a non-fiction book because there are so many books about Daesh or Al-Qaeda or whatever already out there. And I think if you're doing it from a non-fiction vantage point, then you come at it with indictments and condemnations and judgments.
What does the novel offer in comparison?
I think the novel, in comparison, offers you a quieter observation. And it asks the question not, what do we do with radicalism, but how did we get here? Why are we vulnerable to this? And not only how are we vulnerable, but how easy would it be, actually, to be radicalized?
Those are uncomfortable questions. I think it's a really interesting and uncomfortable question to ask.
I think it is, because the answers are terrifying. It's not that you have to be Muslim. It's not that you have to be poor. It's not that you have to be, at a madrasa from age 3. You don't have to have any of those things to be radicalized. I think we see it again and again. One of the most interesting cases that I saw when I was doing the research was this young Dutch soldier. And he'd been a part of the army in his country. And he spoke English, he spoke Dutch, born and bred in the Netherlands. And he didn't feel he had a place there. How frightening is that? That somebody actually included and ingratiated and a part of something can still be pushed outside it. I think that's the thing that we don't see in the non-fiction tellings so far. Or at least I haven't seen them. I mean, of course, there are very good books.
No, I think I really hear what you're saying. It's almost like a very different project in its foundational approach. You're sort of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, not trying to find a general principle.
Yeah.
It was obviously I'm tempted to ask the question, so what do all of these people have in common? You create these 3 protagonists. They've got very different lives. They find themselves in the same place, in the same camp, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that tempts me to ask the question. Yeah. So what is the common thread here? Which is maybe an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I would invite you to answer it.
Well, I think there's probably several ways to answer that, but I suppose the thing they don't have in common is religion. That was sort of clear to me from the beginning. And I think, if we look at the way this has changed over 20 years, it may have begun with a sort of ragtag group of extreme orthodox fundamentalists. But that's not how the story of radicalism has ended. The story of radicalism has ended in a completely different spot as it began, I think. What draws people to radicalism, I think, is pain. So I would say they all have that in common. And that pain can come from a place of anger. It can come from a place of fear. It can come from a place of humiliation, of poverty, of confusion. But I think it's pain at the end.
And extreme pain breeds extreme responses, or seeking extreme.
Absolutely. And I think, the thing, again, we don't talk about too much when we talk about radicalism is how seductive it is for young people, for a young person who feels kicked out of society or community or his or her group of peers, radicalism is incredibly seductive because it says, do you know what? Here you will have power. Not only will you have power, here you will have full power. And you may express that power, not just over your peers, but over masses of people. There nobody listens to you. Well, guess what? Here we're waiting.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.